Welcome to Notorious Minds, where we examine those that have altered destiny and changed human history. I am M.R. Parks. If you have not done so already, please consider subscribing to my channel. Today we are examining the Michigan serial killer. Is a deviant sexual predator who has a sickening set of fetishes. Not only is he a rapist and murderer, but like Ted Bundy, he's a necrophiliac. The state of Michigan wouldn't be safe until they got this sicko off the street. Join me today as we examine who he is. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Warning: the following video contains violent content, graphic images, and descriptions which may be considered disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised.
Art and Nancy Ludwig were a middle-aged couple who enjoyed their time together. Art and Nancy were, by all estimates, a well-rounded couple. They were perfect for each other. Nancy Ludwig was a flight attendant, and because she was a flight attendant at Northwest Airlines, the couple traveled extensively. Art Ludwig had been a successful executive for the entertainment industry and retired relatively early. Nancy was about 13 years younger than him. They felt they had a wonderful life. Art and Nancy were planning for their next vacation during this time. But first, Nancy had a flight she had to go on before they could go on vacation. Most months, Nancy sticks to a set schedule whenever she flies. But to make time for vacation, she signed up as an add-on, a very flexible schedule. Because she was an add-on, she would go with one crew and then join another crew on the next leg on her trip. Art Ludwig didn't like the fact that Nancy did that because she did not know the crew. When you are an add-on, the crew doesn't really know each other, and you're basically on your own. Nancy loved to travel, and she loved meeting new people. She enjoyed her job very much. She left bright and early the next morning for her flight to Detroit. When the 41-year-old flight attendant arrived in Detroit, in the Detroit suburb of Romulus, it was Sunday evening on February 17th. Detroit was not a regular run for Nancy. She had to call to see where the hotel was, to see how to get there. Then she got on the shuttle to the hotel. She would have to join a different crew the following morning for a flight leaving out of the metro airport. Once Nancy got to the hotel, there was no one at the front desk. At the front desk, there was a roster and a clipboard with the flight attendants' and pilots' names on it, and the room number on the clipboard. The flight attendants and the pilots were responsible for signing the clipboard, and then they would take a pass card key with the corresponding room number on it. Nancy's room was 354 at the Hilton Airport Inn. So anybody that wanted to know what room Nancy was in could easily look on that clipboard and know what room she was staying in. That's not very secure. So Nancy signed the clipboard and got her pass card. Unaware, Nancy was being watched by a stranger in the shadows. Nancy goes up to her room at about 9:30 p.m. As the flight attendant, Nancy walks up to her door, and Nancy's trained to not just walk into her hotel room. She would first prop the door open with her luggage and then walk through the door to make sure there was no one else in the room. So Nancy does just that. But when she walks into the hotel room, she doesn't see the man that walked behind her and shut the door. The man grabs Nancy from behind and slams her down and proceeds to tie her up. He also punches her several times and gags her mouth. Another flight attendant by the name of Phil, who just happened to be staying in the room right next to Nancy's, heard something going on in her room. And he became a little suspicious, and he walks to Nancy's door and he knocks on the door. But when he calls out to her to see if everything was okay, he doesn't get a response. He doesn't hear a response from Nancy because Nancy's assailant is holding a serrated knife up against her throat. She was a small woman, but she was a fighter. Nancy tried her best to fight off, but she couldn't. He was too strong. Phil had already returned to her room by this time. 2 hours later, the flight attendant, Phil, who was staying in the next room, happened to be looking out of his window. And what does he see? He sees a man in the parking lot with a flight attendant uniform, and the man has it balled up, the uniform, underneath his arm, and then he stuffs it into the trunk of his car. He's also carrying a luggage, and he throws that into the trunk as well. Phil thought that was weird, why a flight attendant would have his uniform all balled up and throw it into the trunk. Phil was wondering why a man leaving the hotel in an hour when people should be checking in. He thought that was kind of strange. Later the next day, around 1 p.m., the housekeeper goes around the hotel to start cleaning the rooms. It's checkout time, and the housekeeper makes it to Nancy's room. When the housekeeper enters Nancy's room, it's dark and the light switch is not working. She walks over to the window and flings the curtains open. When the housekeeper turns around and looks at the bed, she sees Nancy's dead body lying face down across the bed. Blood is splattered everywhere, and the housekeeper screams. Management immediately alerted police, who were on the scene within minutes. After learning that the room was registered to a woman named Nancy Ludwig, an investigation into the events of the previous night get underway. Detective Dan Snyder was the first detective assigned to the case. When Dan goes into the bathroom, he sees that bloody water is in the shower, meaning the assailant washed after he killed Nancy. Although he had made a point of taking his victim's belongings, including her clothing, jewelry, ID, and luggage, with him when he fled, he had left the blood-soaked washcloth wadded up on the bathroom sink. Investigators bagged the invaluable piece of evidence and anticipating of the time when technology would allow them to harvest the biological evidence that would lead them to the killer, perhaps. An examination of her body revealed multiple stab wounds on Nancy, including a number of deep gashes to her hands, indicating that she fought hard for her life. Besides being stabbed repeatedly, Nancy's face and upper torso bore numerous superficial cuts which had apparently been inflicted for the sole purpose of causing her undue pain. An autopsy would find that after enduring a vicious sexual assault, her throat had been slashed from ear to ear, and with a serrated knife, nearly decapitating her. Her attacker then raped her a second time while she was already dead. What a monster. Detective Dan Snyder observed that the hotel room seemed to be cleaned up. Her luggage was gone. Everything that pertained to Nancy was taken. Whoever did this took a lot of time and care to make sure there was no fingerprints in that room. The crime lab recovered blood and semen samples from Nancy's body, but in 1991, DNA testing is in its infancy. It's not enough to solve the crime as of yet. Later that day, Art Ludwig received a call from the authorities, informing him that he needed to get to Detroit as quickly as possible. Something terrible had happened to his wife. He would find out soon enough that his wife of 13 years had been found murdered in her hotel room. It would be up to him to positively identify his beloved Nancy before the case could move forward. Investigators faced an uphill battle from the get-go, since the airport hotel saw thousands of people coming and going at all hours at any given time. Narrowing down the list of suspects wasn't going to be easy, with guests, employees, maintenance workers, and any number of others to consider, not to mention that a lack of security allowed anyone off the street to come and go as they please at any hour, day or night. The odds of finding the culprit, the one that killed Nancy, were not good. Even so, they had to try for Nancy and any unsuspecting victim yet to come. Detective Dan Snyder questioned everyone that was at the hotel, everyone who worked there, everyone who visited there, everyone that came in the day before, everyone that had any contact with the Hilton Inn by the airport. After learning of the tragedy, a fellow flight attendant had come forward to say she had ridden in the shuttle van with Nancy on the fateful night when she came to the hotel. According to this flight attendant, there had been a third passenger, a man in his 30s who, with an off-putting demeanor, or had made her a little uncomfortable. She recalled that even though there had been room for them to spread out in the van, that the man had made a point of sitting right next to Nancy. As if that weren't strange enough, he hadn't taken his eyes off of her the entire ride from the airport to the hotel. He had made such an impression on the witness that she was able to describe him to police, who distributed his likeness to both the public and the neighboring law enforcement agencies. Despite their efforts, he was never located. After hours of interviews that do nothing to further the investigation, Detective Snyder is feeling discouraged, but then he gets a tip he can run with. The flight attendant, Phil, the man whose room was right next to Nancy, who was Phil said, "I heard this noise next to my room at about 9:30 p.m. Then about an hour or so later, I saw someone carrying a flight attendant's bag with what appeared to be a flight attendant's uniform balled up under his arm. He recognized the uniform immediately and thought, why does this man have this uniform balled up like that? He'll never get those wrinkles out." Phil said that this guy wasn't dressed like a crew member, because he was dressed in sneakers and blue jeans that were cuffed at the ankle and a wrinkled t-shirt. The man he described threw the suitcase in the trunk and then got into his car and drove away quickly. The detective said to Phil, "What kind of car was it?" Phil said it was a dark-colored Monte Carlo. A sketch artist was used to draw out a composite of the man, the sketch that police would put on the wanted posters. 2 weeks go by, and all Art Ludwig, Nancy's husband, can do is wait for new information on his wife's killer. Art finds it difficult to focus on anything else. He was devastated, absolutely devastated. He felt at a loss, not being able to help catch his wife's killer or to bring any closure to her death. In 1981, Dr. Margaret Abbey moved to Flint, Michigan, and started leasing a 2-story gatehouse. In 1985, Dr. Abbey complained to her landlord about break-ins she experienced in her gatehouse, including an incident in January of 1985 in which a compact disc player and her purse were stolen. Dr. Margaret Abbey was a 55-year-old professor at the University of Michigan. She had come home on a chilly night on Friday, November 7, 1986, after a day spent downtown with friends. As she stopped her car and felt around in her jacket for a key to the gate, she suddenly realized that it was already standing ajar. She got back in her car and drove toward her home, looking forward to relaxing after a long day. Just like with the gate, as she approached the front door of her home, she also realized it was unlocked, but questioned if she had just forgotten to lock it when she left earlier. Margaret was said to have a habit of leaving her door unlocked, and none of the windows of her home had curtains. 2 days later, it was Sunday, November 9th, and Margaret was found brutally murdered in her bedroom. She had been attacked, raped, and stabbed to death. The police investigation of Dr. Abay's death focused primarily on persons who might have been known to the doctor. There appeared to be no signs of forced entry. Police interviewed a number of suspicious persons, but there was never any evidence that developed that linked those persons to Dr. Abay's death. The evidence collected included DNA from the doctor's body, as well as a partial fingerprint from a faucet inside the gatehouse. The case went cold until 6 years later, 2 weeks after Art Ludwig's wife's brutal murder. Art Ludwig was contacted by the son of Dr. Abay. When the victim's son, Mark, came upon the story of Nancy Ludwig's murder with nothing to go on but intuition, he called authorities certain that the same fiend committed both crimes. Young Mark should have been a detective. While her killer had been careful to clean up after himself, he had left behind a single latent fingerprint on one of the knobs in the bathroom sink. After reading about Nancy's slaying, Mark had come to the conclusion that both Nancy and his mother had fallen victim to a serial killer. In Mark's letter to Mr. Ludwig, he said, "My mother was murdered in her bedroom. She was bound, gagged, and her throat had been cut with a serrated knife. She was found on her stomach, pillows underneath her. She was in the same position as your wife. She was also petite and had shoulder-length brown hair, just like your wife." Struck by the similarities of the crimes, Mr. Ludwig and the police believe it was the same person. Detective Dan Snyder does attempt to follow up. Dan calls the lead investigator on the murder of Dr. Margaret Abay. And the detective says, "Oh, no. We know who did it. We just don't have enough evidence to convict them as of yet. Our cases aren't linked." And just like that, the promising link turns into a quick dead end. There was no place to go with that for the detective, so he let it go. In the meantime, Detective Dan Snyder is getting inundated with other tips. Nancy Ludwig's murder was a huge news. It was one of the biggest hotels in the area, right next to the airport. It was all over the news. Dan Snyder spent an incredible amount of time investigating literally every possible connection to Nancy's murder. At that point, her case goes cold, and nothing else turns up concerning her case for nearly a decade. As Nancy's case gets old, then suddenly technology advances. And in 2001, the Detroit police start putting some of that technology to work. In 2001, Detroit started a cold case squad, again, where they reviewed cases in the past that had not been solved. They used new DNA technology that could possibly be used to help solve some of these unsolved homicides. When detectives submit the blood samples for Nancy Ludwig's murder, the DNA results don't match anyone in the CODIS database. CODIS stands for Combined DNA Index System. It is a computer program and database of DNA profiles used by law enforcement to solve crimes. So CODIS automatically compares DNA profiles from crime scenes with profiles from convicted offenders and missing persons. When a match is found, law enforcement can identify suspects and coordinate investigations. CODIS can also link multiple crime scenes together, which can help identify serial offenders, like the one in Nancy's case. Even though CODIS does not connect to any suspect in Nancy's case, they do connect to Dr. Ebay's case. In 2002, cold case detectives decided to run the fingerprints in Dr. Margaret Ebay's bathroom from her faucet through the national database. To their surprise, they got a hit. The print matched a 39-year-old suspect, a known offender who had been arrested in Florida in the 1980s for following women around and bashing them in the back of their head. The results of the DNA tests from the homicide were compared with those from Nancy Ludwig's homicide. It revealed that it was the same person, just like Mark, Dr. Ebay's son, had said previously. The lead investigator in Flint was wrong. The two rapes and murders were proved to be the work of one person by matching semen samples. Back in 1991, technology had not advanced enough to test the two semen samples of the women. But in 2001, we had all the technology we needed. Taken from the two crime scenes, the assailant had left a latent fingerprint in Dr. Ebay's crime scene. When it was matched to him, the Michigan State Police learned the killer's identity. When solving some cases, all you need is time and patience. Partial print had never been compared to fingerprints on file with the FBI until now. There was actually a match made. Nancy's killer was finally revealed. Detective Dan Snyder calls a person who's been waiting desperately for so long, Nancy's husband, Art Ludwig. Detective Snyder calls Mr. Ludwig and says, "Mr. Ludwig, we've got him. His name is Jeffrey Wayne Gorton." Jeffrey Wayne Gorton was born on November 1st, 1962. Jeffrey was only 29 years old when he murdered Nancy Ludwig. In the 80s, right before his first murder of Dr. Ebay, Jeffrey Gorton had been living in a trailer park in Orlando, Florida with his first wife and son while serving in the Navy. The suspect of the neighborhood rumor mill, it was said that he had been caught on several occasions stealing women's panties from the common laundry room. His behavior became so out of control that his disgraced family had been forced to find other accommodation. After being accused of attacking women on the base, he was placed under arrest. He had no more than posted bond before being arrested again for breaking and entering. Because he was a repeat offender, he was tried and sentenced to 4 years behind bars. Less than 2 years later, he was back out on the street, but then his wife had wisely chosen to file for divorce, effectively cutting ties with her troubled husband she no longer knew. But when he got out, he moved to Michigan. Jeffrey Wayne Gorton worked for the sprinkler company in Flint, Michigan that serviced the sprinklers of Dr. Margaret Ebay's yard. Gorton had serviced Margaret Ebay's sprinkler system several days before her death. Several months after he had started working there, she was found murdered in her gatehouse. Jeffrey Wayne Gorton is arrested on February 8, 2002. Gorton was a very ordinary looking person. despite being nicknamed Uncle Perv by his co-workers due to his unhealthy attitudes toward women. Jeffrey Gorton married a second time and fathered 2 children with his new wife, Sandra. This union, just like the first, would end when his true nature came to light. He lived in a nice house in the suburbs. He was, to all appearances, the classic dad, always doing stuff with his kids. Anything that was needed done at his church, he would always volunteer for it. While the fingerprint match put Jeffrey Gorton inside Dr. Ebay's home, since he worked on the premises, investigators needed more. Convinced that Jeffrey was also the man responsible for the rape and murder of Nancy Ludwig, they began tailing their newfound suspect with the goal of acquiring a DNA sample. After following him to a skating rink where he had shared pizza with his children, they had to retrieve his drinking cup. When the saliva lifted from the rim was analyzed, it was found to contain 2 markers from it, meaning that more than one person drank out of his cup, most likely his child. The good news, for lack of a better term, was that one of those markers was the individual who had raped and murdered Nancy Ludwig. On the strength of this powerful piece of evidence, a judge granted investigators a search warrant for Gorton's residence. Hold on to your seats. This ride gets even more sickening from here. When the investigators talked to Jeffrey, they didn't initially tell him that they had a DNA match. They wanted to see if he would confess to his crimes. But Gorton doesn't admit to anything, even after he learns of the DNA evidence against him. Since Jeffrey didn't confess to the crimes, the police had to use other avenues at their disposal. Once Jeffrey is arrested, police search Jeffrey's property, and they find more evidence than they ever thought they would. Jeffrey seemed to be a collector of women's things. Inside Jeffrey's property, police found hundreds of women's lingerie, many of which had been tagged with the original owner's name, the physical description, as well as the location where he acquired them. Clotheslines, apartment, homes, wherever he found them. It was astonishing, quite honestly, the amount of lingerie that Jeffrey had in his home. Jeffrey would literally break into someone else's home, take their lingerie. Wouldn't it be easier just to buy women's lingerie? I'm just saying. Instead of breaking into individuals' homes, but I guess that's part of the thrill. Clearly, Jeffrey was a deviant sexual predator. Little old Jeffrey had been in hundreds of people's homes. Like many people who have this same problem as Jeffrey, there usually is a progression from stalking to breaking and entering to assault to murder. But the evidence doesn't stop there. In another box, wait till you hear this, the police find videotape, and not just ordinary videotapes. The police view the videotapes and they uncover something even more disturbing. It seems Jeffrey liked to film himself in women's underwear. He had a video camera set up, get this, in the same room that he slept with his wife. He had a videotape in a guest room also, and had set up video cameras in the bathrooms of his home, and he was disturbingly videotaping people when they used his bathroom. You really don't know what's in a person's mind, do you? Needless to say, the police weren't happy with having to look and sit through hours of deviant sexual behavior on film. This man, and I use that word loosely, has a compulsion that went way too far. When he was interviewed by police, he refused to admit to any wrongdoing. Unable to tell the truth, he had denied ever setting foot in Dr. Margaret Abay's bathroom, thereby eliminating any legitimate reason for his fingerprint being on the knob in her bathroom. When confronted with the fingerprint and the DNA evidence, he held firm to his declaration of innocence. The Wayne County District Attorney wasn't buying it. Confident that they would obtain a conviction, the state officially charged Jeffrey Gorton with the rapes and murders of Nancy Ludwig and Dr. Margaret Abay. Jeffrey Wayne Gorton is charged with 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of criminal sexual conduct, and 2 counts of first-degree murder. On August 16, 2002, the case goes to trial. The Michigan State Police DNA expert testified that there was a 1 in 97 quadrillion chance that the DNA found on Nancy's body matched anyone other than Jeffrey Wayne Gorton. As for how the crimes were perpetrated, it is believed that he entered Dr. Margaret Abay's residence through an unlocked door. After overpowering the petite 55-year-old woman, he had sexually assaulted her before stabbing her multiple times and slitting her throat. He had then washed off in the bathroom sink, leaving the lone latent fingerprint that would later link him to her crime. In Nancy's case, investigators speculated that Gorton had been lying in wait in the stairwell on the 3rd floor on the night of her murder. When he saw the pretty flight attendant opening the door to her room, he had leapt out and forced her into her hotel room by knife point. After placing a gag in her mouth and binding her hands with twine, he had raped, tortured, and ultimately killed the devoted wife and stepmother of 3. Cleaned up the bathroom, wiped the body with a washcloth, packed everything in the blood-stained room that might identify him, including the wash, and hanged the Do Not Disturb sign on the outside of the door. Art Ludwig flew to Detroit the next day to identify his wife's body. He later said that his life was over too. Jeffrey Gorton killed 2 people that night, Ludwig said. He killed Nancy and he killed me. My life was over as I knew it. Using all his television and media sources, he campaigned to publish the slayings. Tips poured in and filled 2 file cabinets at Romulus police station after her slaying. Rewards in upwards of $80,000 was offered for anyone who could provide information into Nancy's murder during that time. Jeffrey Gorton's defense attorney, Craig Tank, did not present a defense or try to challenge the validity of the DNA evidence. Jeffrey Gorton also reportedly changed his mind at the last minute and decided not to testify. But really, what would be his defense? What could he possibly say? In September of 2002, Jeffrey Gorton was convicted of criminal sexual misconduct and first-degree murder in the death of Nancy Ludwig. Choosing to forego another trial, he had pleaded guilty to killing Margaret Abay. He is currently serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. Those present during the court proceedings would later note, get this, that Gorton had seemed transfixed by a juror who had borne a striking resemblance to Nancy Ludwig. Unable to tear his eyes away, he had leered at her throughout the trial, proving that he couldn't feign normality, even when it was in his own best interest. That's how much his deviant sexual nature came out. Jeffrey is serving out his sentence at the Richard A. Hanlon Correctional Facility in Michigan. He will die there. Because of Nancy's case, the hotel industry does security far differently after that. With that, Jeffrey Wayne Gorton now rests safely behind bars. The families of his victims can take some comfort in the knowledge that this monster who took the lives of those they loved the most will no longer be a threat to anyone. Law enforcement officials, while pleased with the outcome of the case, are united in their belief that Dr. Margaret Abbey and Nancy Ludwig were only the tip of the iceberg. Considering his history and his apparent inability to control his deviant urges, they fear that the list of victims is far greater than anyone will ever truly know. Unfortunately, since he refuses to provide details of the murders of which he had been convicted, much less those that exist only in theory, the odds of his ever coming clean are slim to none. Consequently, we will probably never know how many women met their fate at the hands of Jeffrey Wayne Gorton. Nancy Ludwig and Dr. Margaret Abbey paid a horrible price at the hands of a deviant sexual predator, but thanks to God, we have the advancements today to catch persons like him much quicker. May the beautiful women that suffered at the hands of this evil monster rest in eternal peace. This is Notorious Minds, and I am M.R. Parks. Thank you for joining me today. Please like and share, and by all means subscribe to this channel. Remember to click the notification bell and you will be notified the next time I upload a new video. Take care of yourselves. Be safe out there. See you next time.